Hello, everyone. My name is Blerina Vila. I am, in this context, a consultant that has been working with DEFCO B1 for the past year for the drafting of the EU Gender Action Plan and also for the preparation of guidance notes to assist with the implementation of the GAP at your level. Marina gave us the overview of what the GAP is all about. I would like to take us step by step for the next 40 minutes on how which of the parts of the GAP can be put into action. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to put them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring them, and if there are enough questions, such as 3 to 4, after a certain amount of time, I will stop and answer to them. Also, the other colleagues can chip in. So, to start with, it is important to for the gender focal persons first to be very familiar with the Gender Action Plan document as it is. So if there were a step 0 in the process of implementing the GAP, starting from the 1st of January next year, is to familiarize yourself very thoroughly with the document, with the core document, and most importantly with the table, where you will notice that each of the 4 priority areas that have been decided, have been included in the GAP, are elaborated in specific actions and have indicators attached to them. So first and foremost, familiarize yourself with the document. If questions arise, please do not hesitate to contact B1. That will help also clarify your inquiries. In addition, we will very shortly share through email the guidance note. It's a relatively short document, which we would also invite you to give your feedback as you go on reading it, to help us identify gaps or where you see missing answers to what kind of information you need to help you implement in the GAP. Once you are confident that you know the document well, you understand what is required, you understand the difference between the 4 priority areas, namely, there is one priority area that is an introspective one, that is focused on institutional culture shift and requires a number of actions to be taken internally at the level of the delegation and in cooperation with the member states at the country level. And then there are 3 thematic priorities, which Marina listed earlier. The requirements, such as reporting, are slightly different for the 4 altogether. For the institutional culture shift, you can consider it as a part of the GAP where there is no choice whether you pursue all of the steps, all of the actions that are listed in it or not. That is mandatory for all of the delegations, including the EU member states. Whereas for the thematic priorities, there is more flexibility in what actions you can elect or select to pursue at the country level, based, of course, on consultation and analysis, including with the EU member states. We are going to go into that in more details. At this stage, when you are thinking about the implementation of the GAP, it is useful to start making a list of the partners on which you can rely. Internally at the delegation, with the EU member states, but also country partners such as the National Machinery for Gender Equality, for example, or the Ministry of Gender, otherwise said, civil society organizations, etc. And very importantly, think about the networking with your peers. There are many instances when questions to you or challenges or obstacles are present within other delegations. Other gender focal persons have had to deal with a given situation. They might help you in finding the solution. This networking can happen through email, of course, but also remember that there is the capacity for dev.eu platform where there is a restricted group where the gender focal persons can communicate openly on issues that they have to deal with. So it is quite important. There is, of course, a large number of instruments. There is the EC toolkit on gender mainstreaming. There is the new e-resource package on gender that Benedetta will be explaining later on. There are briefing notes that focus on specific sectors such as infrastructure, health, education, etc. There are briefing notes. There is a briefing note on indicators. However, there is a guidance note for the implementation of the GAP, but sometimes you might not still find answers to your question. You might need something more practical or more immediate. So it's good to leverage the network of your peers. The next step, let's go on to let's say, a core requirement and activity of the GAP, which is gender analysis. As it happens, as you know very well, all exercises, a careful planning exercise requires a careful analysis, situational analysis. Very often so far we see a stark lack of gender analysis, stark lack of use of gender analysis whenever contextual analysis is happening. Therefore, this has become a key requirement of the Gender Action Plan 2016-20. The gender analysis needs to be pursued vehemently and very rigorously because it will be the basis for the identification of priorities, for identification of good objectives and results that go into the direction of meeting the requirements of the EU and the commitments that the EU has taken upon itself. And in terms of planning, of course, this gender analysis that so far we haven't been very good in doing will provide a baseline for us to measure progress in what the EU is contributing to gender equality between men and women, gender equality through its cooperation efforts. There are 3 moments in which you can consider, I mean, the baseline here is that gender analysis needs to happen. When it needs to happen, there are a few options. You might be aware already that gender profile was a requirement also with the existing Gender Action Plan to be attached as an annex to the multi-annual indicative program. Some delegations performed on this and some others didn't. However, where this gender analysis, so a gender country profile, does not exist yet, that would be a place to start. And to make sure that resources are used, they can be resources. You have flexibility, creativity there to use resources that are available to you at the delegation level to make sure that this gender profile is produced. The gender profile, as well as other types of gender analysis I'll be touching on later, would ideally give you at least 4, let's say, types of information. They would look into what data is available, what statistics are available on situations, so a situation of women and girls and men and boys. So we have the sex disaggregated, age disaggregated, to provide a baseline for the sectors, the concentration sectors most likely in which delegation is working. Identify key barriers to achieving gender equality in the country, mapping of partners, including civil society, public authorities, etc., including also international development partners, and a mapping of knowledge that exists or gaps that are in place. This would provide enough information for gender-sensitive planning at the delegation level. Another entry point for using gender analysis would be also this, what I just explained, it is an initiative that the delegation can take on its own, using its own resources, of course. There have been different examples of how delegations have carried this out. I'll mention them in a second. Another way in which gender analysis, as required by the GAP, can happen is through the coordinating mechanisms with the EU member states. You are required through the GAP, I mean we are required, the delegations and headquarters, to identify priorities for action in which the delegation will focus to achieve gender equality results for the next 5 years. In order to do this, the coordination with EU member states as a minimum is required, and other partners as may be appropriate would be also included. For this type of analysis, so it's more of a consultative process. It can generate an ex novo gender analysis if that is the case, if EU member states and the delegation can dedicate resources to it. So that would be a different way to generate the counter profile that I mentioned earlier. There is, let's say, an accountability hook regarding this. It is an obligation from the GAP to have a selection of priorities in which the EU will focus in the partner country for the next 5 years. This will happen through use of gender analysis, as I mentioned, as well as through coordination with EU member states. It is expected of all the countries, so delegation and the member states, to identify the priorities and to report them to Brussels by mid-2016. That would be our baseline for overview, and will give us an initial overview on the areas in which EU is contributing to gender equality in the partner countries. So it is important for you to note this down, please. Another way in which gender analysis will contribute to making gender equality objective part and parcel of the cooperation is through gender contextual analysis of the new actions. So for the preparation of the new action documents starting from January 2016, when the annual action planning starts, it is mandatory to ensure that gender analysis happens. How this can happen? It could be through at least a couple of ways. Integrating gender analysis methodology and questions in the contextual situation analysis that will happen during the identification for a new action. Or it could happen through inclusion of gender expertise in the mission that is carrying out the identification and drafting of the action document, etc. So this is mandatory, and it's an obligation that will be monitored through the system Julia is going to talk to us about later on. Examples on how gender analysis have happened already. One is from Zambia in 2014. The delegation dedicated funds available to them to hire an expert to do a gender desk review and analysis of existing information to provide a gender profile that would be used for the multi-annual indicative program. In truth, this gender profile came after the MIP was finalized. However, the information in the gender profile was used for an internal staff paper on the entry points for gender mainstreaming into the new action that was to be undertaken with 11th EDF. Another example from Tanzania. Here the task for generating the gender profile was assigned to an internal junior staff that did a desk review, collected information, and did a brief profile that was subsequently used by staff into the drafting of new action documents. So it became immediately useful in that sense. There are plenty other examples. The fact that I'm not mentioning some countries that have already done the gender analysis, it's not a judgment on the quality of their work. So now we go on to, let's call it step 2, the planning and programming. We will focus on the annual plans. With all said on gender analysis, it is clear that it is a very important step. Resources for it need to be dedicated, and it needs to be generated in useful time to be used for the drafting of the, for example, action documents. Are there any questions so far? So please don't be shy, ask questions, because this is a good opportunity to do so. There are 2 people typing. Excellent. Thank you so much to the 3 brave souls. Excellent. Thank you, Mariam. Yes. Provided that the question is, if gender analysis already exists, can it be used? If the source is, let's say, trustworthy, and with that we can refer to analyze gender analysis generated from other EU member states, for example, or recognized international players such as World Bank, etc., or the country itself. This is important. The country generates periodically every 5 years report on the UN Convention on elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. So that is also a source of information on the situation of men and women in the country. And so do also the civil society organizations who provide a shadow report to the CEDAW. So of course, by all means, identify and use these resources. So the CEDAW, you must be familiar with the convention name, asks the countries to generate reports. They are a bit far apart because it's every 5 years, and not all the countries are rigorous to follow the schedule for submitting the reports. But where they do exist and where they are within 5 years from now, please by all means refer to them, because in terms of gaps, in terms of key questions that need addressing, it is a trustworthy and official, let's say, reference. So there are cases where, for example, in DRC, there was a gender analysis generated through resources, through an investment from 4 different EU member states, and that has become now the reference for gender analysis for also the delegation. And yeah, in the case of other donors, it's like I said, if they are trustworthy sources, if the information responds to your planning needs, and you get the information that you require for the drafting of your action document, why not? It is very welcome. And I think, yeah, I'm just confirming with the boss here. The boss says yes. How often does about the resources that are required? Well, I will be a bit circumspect here, but one good place to look for resources to generate the gender country profile could be the technical facility. There is a pocket of money that you can use for generating analysis for planning purposes. Gender analysis is just as valid an analysis as any other contextual analysis that you do for identification purposes. And so these are also resources you can tap on. How often does a gender country profile need to be updated? I would say not less than 5 years, but for the purposes of for example, monthly annual indicative program, considering that there is an MTR midterm review coming in a couple of years, why not make an update to correspond with that event? so that when you do your lobbying, your advocacy for integrating gender equality indicators, hopefully, in the MIP after the review, you can have good arguments and fresh information to back your advocacy with. All right, so we go on to the annual plans. I will start here immediately with an example on how. Let me first open a parenthesis here. The Gender Action Plan requires, the Gender Action Plan, let's say, recognizes a three-pronged approach. It is a carry-on from the earlier, from the current Gender Action Plan, which means that we have the possibility of performing let's say, applying gender mainstreaming into the action of the actions carried within the cooperation framework with the countries. And gender mainstreaming would be the process through which you integrate gender concerns into all the sectors. The second prong would be designing and carrying out specific actions targeting a specific inequality between men and women, or a specific situation of men or of women that needs attention. And the third prong, as required by the GAP, is political dialogue. And this is very important for the planning exercises. Actually, the political and policy dialogue would be very, I would imagine it as an umbrella action that means that will have an impact on all the efforts that you do to make sure that the EU delegation cooperation is giving good results in terms of gender equality. What does that mean in practical terms regarding political dialogue is that first and foremost, it has to be clear to you as a gender focal person, but also at the delegation and to the hierarchy, that the gender focal person is not the person responsible for gender equality results for the delegation. You are a catalyst and you are a facilitator. The ultimate responsibility rests, of course, with the hierarchy and, if I may say so, the head of delegation. So this is a message that needs to be put across, and you need to build on start building on as soon as you can, because that would facilitate also, hopefully, your work internally in mobilizing your colleagues to carry out gender mainstreaming. For this, we have a number of tools and instruments to facilitate your work. It is always the EC toolkit is a very good place to start with, but also the new EU resource package that will be shown to you later provides tools such as speaking notes, for example, or thematic briefs that give you some concise and good material to provide speaking notes for your heads of delegation or head of operation or hierarchy when they are meeting with country authorities, when they are discussing in forums, etc. One of the requirements of the GAP also is that the EU at the country level will have to elect a champion at the level of the head of missions to make sure that the EU as a whole comes to the country with a clear and unified agenda regarding gender equality. And so it is in this sense that I was saying earlier that political dialogue covers and will have an effect on all of the work that you do ultimately at the operational level on how the gender equality objectives is presented vis-a-vis the country authorities and your section. Yes, okay. So let me just take a small break here to answer to some of the questions. May we send the slides for the webinar? We will share the guidance note with you that has the information that I'm sharing right now. We can also, as Federica is mentioning, we can send the link to this presentation you are seeing. Olivier Louis is saying, further to the head of the delegation, I suppose that cultural shifts will entail that every single person, yes, at a given delegation feels responsible. Excellent point. Marina is going to touch on it. But yes, you have said it beautifully. There's nothing to add to it. Is it possible to have material, for instance, in French, speaking points in French? Yes. Some already is available, so voila. So the GAP is already translated in French and Portuguese. The presentation for the GAP is also likewise. And also, please remember the capacity for dev.eu. It's also a place where those who have the information in any other language or in any language, and those who have already done speaking notes for their boss can also share the information. Removing sensible information, it's up to you. Is this training recorded? Yes. Okay, so I was going to share with you an example on how the gender mainstreaming has happened at the annual action planning level in Tanzania, under the initiative of the head of operation. There was a mini-series of actions pursued. It started with an overall presentation to a large number of staff, not all delegation staff, although everybody was invited, but all the heads of sections were involved. The head of operation also was at the lead of this initiative. During the first presentation, the head of operation presented the report for the GAP that was prepared under his care. And identified the areas in which the delegation had performed well, and others were, according to the GAP indicators, there was still work in progress, work needed. At this point, the head of operation asked for a select number of new action documents to be volunteered as targets, or as, let's say, as case studies, to be worked upon for gender mainstreaming. A few action documents were volunteered. One of these, for example, was food security, which was under the heading of the concentration sector rural development. Subsequently, after this initial presentation, come a little bit of training on gender mainstreaming principles and methodologies. We worked with the section, so head of section plus 2 staff. We sat together with a gender expert. At this point, a template, or let's say a draft action plan or entry points for gender mainstreaming in the new action documents were presented and discussed thoroughly with the section. Some were retained, some were dropped, and so ultimately in this particular case, the action documents ended up reformulating one of the specific objectives to include empowerment of women as one of the objectives of this particular food security action document. The reason for this was that the section was convinced that there was a strong enough link between empowerment of women, maternal health and health of under 5 years of age children, and the actions undertaken for food security with this particular program. So this was a direct, let's say, kind of sequence of events that brought to a gender mainstreamed program in the end of it. And again, for the action, for the, let's say, for gender mainstreaming to work at this level of planning, you need, there is really no other way to say this. You need to do the gender analysis. How you do it is you can generate a specific gender analysis. Please consider including or dedicating funds from the budget that is available for the new action. You can include gender expertise in the team that does the drafting of the action plan. You can include consultation with knowledgeable gender I'm calling them actors. So they can be gender specialists from the EU member state. They can be, and importantly, from the gender equality machinery at the country level. They can be representatives of civil society. So there are different ways that you can bring in these gender concerns in the drafting process of the new action plans. And quite frankly, there is no choice now. It has to be done because, as you will see when Julia presents indicators and reporting, there will be a follow-up. Performance will be measured on how well we are faring or not on gender equality, using the GAP as a guideline on this. In terms of budgets, okay, so now we are going into step 3, identification of formulation. In terms of budget support, sector budget support and general budget support, again, the starting point is the gender analysis. Very importantly here, in order to be able to influence decisions made and formulation of results. Hold on, I will stop here because there is a question regarding the action plan. Olivier Louis is asking, when preparing the action plan, should the gender analysis have a specific sectoral focus to look into specific issues, opportunities linked to the formulation of a precise action? Or should the delegation apply some kind of standard approach?
Let me take this out. Come here.
Your first option is the best option. So the gender analysis will give you an overview of the issues on which you need to make a choice and focus within the concentration sector. There is, in fact, the gender action plan is promoting a very flexible approach to the thematic priorities. What you will see in the document when you read it is, so we have these 3 major thematic clusters within which examples of type actions have been proposed, which serve to inspire you and the EU member states at the country level, and indicators, but I'm not going to go into it, but indicators that come from SDG and the EU resource framework have been proposed there. Within this limits, you know, sky's the limit for you. If your gender analysis takes you in a certain direction, that's where you need to go. There is no standard approach in what kind of gender issues or gender inequalities you need to focus on. Brussels is not going to give you that kind of directive. So there is a generic framework provided with the GAP, but the selection of the priorities will have to happen through the gender analysis. I hope that I answered your question, Olivier. All right. So about the sector, in terms of general budget, sector budget support, a lot of the work in terms of gender mainstreaming has to happen through policy dialogue, has to happen through the sectoral coordination tables, and through the sector, the consultations, sector consultation, can't find the word now. So, but so is the agenda for where you do the analysis of the sector policy. When you negotiate with the country partners, you renegotiate and you meet again and again to finally decide the performance framework for the sector, etc., etc. And then annually you will have your progress report. So for gender mainstreaming to work, you potentially will not need to invent new processes to make sure that gender mainstreaming happens, but you will ideally infiltrate, as it were, the process that are already in place. This requires some men and women power. So this requires numbers, Therefore, it is important that you coordinate with member states, or that you leverage the capacity of gender actors in the country. I will give you an example of what happened in Ethiopia for the Productive Safety Network program, which is a 10-donor program. It's a government donor supported by 10 donors, among which the EU delegation. This is a long, perhaps some of you already know this program, but it's going on for quite a number of years. It's a large program. It covers 8 million beneficiaries. The government already has a stated intention of promoting gender equality through the actions of this program that is basically food security and social protection. There was in that particular program a gender analysis done 4 years prior to when the process started. This was last year. So that gave a solid basis regarding gaps and regarding critical issues that were not being addressed or not being addressed sufficiently through the program, and still areas that remained of concern regarding gender equality. From this basis, the EU delegation took the initiative, using resources from a program that was a thematic, funded with thematic source, so it's a centrally managed program. So the EU delegation draw on this to make sure that expertise on gender was available as and when the delegation needed. The delegation did an extensive and very intensive work in keeping gender equality, gender mainstreaming as a topic in all the meetings with the donor group, in meetings with the government. And they were really being very specific, very, let's say, insistent about this. And it was not the gender focal person who did this, but it was the person responsible within the section of rural development that took the lead. So they mobilized the support at the government level, mobilized the support within the donor group, made sure that the attention was kept at an optimum level. What happened then was that a consultation was organized to design an action plan on gender for the new phase of the PSNP, so the Productive Safety Network program. This consultative process involved people from regions, so local authorities, implementing agents, of course with the support of the government, because all the people that participated in the consultation are public servants. An action plan was generated, and I'm very happy to say that now it is part of the Program Implementation Manual, which is the Bible for the implementation of the PSNP. Indicators have been assigned to the action plan. So now it is a matter of ordinary management, that the measures that were identified and included in the action plan happen throughout the implementation of the program. I've been told that I have only 1 minute left, so I prefer to spend it using answering to a question if one is upcoming. If you don't have questions, maybe they will come to you while you read the guidance note we are going to share with you. Constructively read the guidance note and let us know if there are things that you don't find answers for in it. So now I let it to Julia to speak about.